So in this video I want to talk about the main processing loop. The last one we went through the event processing loop, and I covered off what was happening there. The main processing loop is where all the work of the framework is actually done. This is a while loop, so it's going to start and it's going to run in parallel with the event loop, and it's going to run until we tell it to stop. Um, we've got the framework being set up, as I explained before, on the notification queue created and passed in to the MPL as a parameter, as well as a notifier. I'll come back to the notifier shortly. So within this while loop, what we're doing is reading the notification queue. Well, we're actually waiting until we can get a message off it, and then we're passing it into this case structure for processing. Now, each of these the case entries matches a potential message that can come from the notification queue. The actual parameter here is linked to the case notification, and this is the message identifier. And so within the case structure itself, we have all these potential messages that it can respond to, and that really tells us that this case structure is operating like a state machine. We'll run from one of these states to another appropriate state, and within the main blog itself I show you those states as the state machine diagram. All these states here are potential messages, and the defaults, like any particular case or switch statement in a language, is what happens if none of these cases match. In this case, obviously, just like there, it's a default setting. What we're also passing in is a value of timed out. So if it doesn't recognize any of these messages or it's timed out, then we've clearly got a problem, and this selector is based on that timed out. So if it has timed out, it's true, we get one message. If it hasn't timed out, that's because we don't recognize the message that's come in, and there's no reason why that should be the case, but during debugging it has been known to happen. We get a different message in, and we format that error message, create an error, and pass it out into our error processing. I'll just briefly cover the error processing. Not only do we pass the error in, we're actually passing a value to say exit on error. Now, if we've got an error, there's not much more we can do with this loop. So I do want the application here to shut down if we've got an error created, and the error processing is just determining really what should actually happen there, and is setting up the next state to occur in that main processing loop. So we've got the notification queue in because I need to put a message on it, and we're also passing in a potential array of errors that we should ignore if we don't want to process in them. To actually process them. So given that we do want to exit on error, this is coming in if in the state of -1. -1 means that we haven't found that error on the ignore list, so it needs to get processed. And if we want to exit on error, and we do because it was true, it's going to put an exit message onto the queue. Otherwise, it's going to put an error message, it's an error state, onto the queue. And if we do want to stop the processing, we raise the stop event, and that is for the application itself, which will get processed in the event processing loop. So either one of these states is going to cause the application to stop, and we just put that back onto the queue. And so if we look at it, so when the loop comes back around again, it's going to read an exit or an error state off the queue here. An exit means we can pull the data out, and we stop the main processing loop. And you'll also notice that we have this channel here where we take the true value, the value coming out, and we pass it over to the results handling loop, and we also attach that to the stop condition. So if we stop the main processing loop, we automatically stop the results handling loop, and what that ensures is that this doesn't just keep running unnecessarily, but we also don't stop it before we've finished processing this loop here. So and the error in the error handling, if we passed it through as an error, we could do something here, for example, to log it somewhere so we know what happened at the moment. In the default setup of this application, we don't do anything. So if we were to pick up an existing state, so one of the first states that actually happens is to initialize, and that when we create the framework up here, the first state that's message that's put onto the queue is to initialize, and that's where in this state here we can set up our front panel entries that we just want to clear out, make sure there's no error messages being displayed, and we've turned off the running LED here. And this is putting a refresh message onto the queue, so when it comes back around again we pull off the refresh message, and that shifts us onto the refresh state. And what's happening here is it's going through a process of, which I've called resource enumerator. What's happening there is that we're looking to see what instruments are attached to the PC, and we're using the values that come out of there to load up the combo boxes 1 and 2. So those are on the front screen here. This is combo box 1 instruments, and the second combo box instruments 2, which we're not actually using in this particular example, but it gets loaded just in case a future example or future application does use it. Loads those values in, and we come back around, and now we're waiting because there's no message, there's no state transition passed in here. We're just waiting, and really what we're waiting on is a user event to come in from here. So on the front panel, of course, we could refresh, but refresh would just run us straight back into here. What we're most likely to do is to get ID, and when we look at what happens with get ID is we enqueue a message action 1. So that's enqueued. We read it out of here, so our next state is action 1, and this is where we're actually really starting to tell the framework to do something, and I'm going to come on to this in a bit more detail in one of the future videos. I don't want to go through it too much, I just want to concentrate at the moment on the main processing loop. But you can see here we are we prepare the interaction, we tell the framework to actually run that, and it, ultimately when we will come back around again. Now if nothing, the framework I know will put some messages on the queue here, and but we could also be waiting on the front panel to do something. Typically we might end up stopping the application running, and stop it, we've already seen this, it's just raising a stop event, and the stop event is just adding the stop message onto the queue. So eventually we'll hit the stop state, which actually puts on the exit state. Now we could do something in here when the application is stopping before it's fully stopped. Perhaps we'd want to inset that and tell it to ignore the stop, or we want to do some tidying up processes, and then it would go on to do an exit process. With this case is if we've got no errors, we're just passing through, and at this point here we're telling the main processing loop to stop. It also tells the results handling loop to stop, and then we exit the while loop, and we tidy up the framework before we actually fully stop it. So I think that's fairly clear. Within the states here, with the events here, I've programmed up the action 2 button through to the action 10 buttons, and they're just putting the same type of state message onto the queue, and you can see here action 2, it's sort of coded up to do nothing. We're not actually passing any commands in to the framework to actually run, but they're there for future use. coded up. Now you'll notice also when we run action 1, which is the getID action, we're also passing in this notifier, and the notifier, the results notifier, it takes as data type or a read command. We're actually passing that in, and you'll notice that goes all the way through to where we run the interaction. And the notifier allows us to, as the framework is running and generating results, it can put those results in the form of the read command that was used to generate them onto a notifier, and down here in the results handling loop where we're waiting on the notifier, as soon as that notifier is raised, it will then run in and process that that notification. I'll come on to the results handling loop and why that seems very similar to an event when I cover this in the next video. So the main processing loop then is really just a state machine, and those states are managed really by the events that are generated from within, or the messages that are generated within the event loop, or by messages that are generated within the framework itself to move it on. I hope that gives you a good idea to that. I'll come on to the framework in a future video. The next one will cover the results handling loop.